A king orders newborn boys to be thrown into the Nile. Centuries later, a mighty empire boasts of scattering 27,290 Israelites to every corner of its realm. The story behind the rulers who targeted the Jews isn't just one of hate, but of calculated policy and survival against impossible odds. But what makes an entire civilization cling to its identity when the world's most ruthless powers come for its very existence? The answers begin where legends collide with evidence. Fear drove a nameless pharaoh to extremes. In the Nile Delta, a growing community of outsiders, descendants of Jacob, had become both a workforce and a threat. Egyptian records from the New Kingdom show Semitic laborers pressed into service, their names echoing through ancient lists, Asher and Shifra. They mixed mud and straw for bricks and built storehouses in cities like Pithom and Ramses. The Brooklyn Papyrus, centuries old even then, describes foreign slaves marked by their language and their labor. Yet the pharaoh's fear was not just of numbers, but of the future. He ordered every Hebrew boy to be drowned in the river, a calculated attempt to break a people by erasing a generation. The trauma of that decree shaped memory and ritual. In the book of Exodus, mothers hid their sons. One child set afloat in a basket would later become Moses. The story spread by word of mouth and then by text, a warning and a promise. Identity could be targeted but not erased. Archaeology at Tel El Daba reveals layers of Canaanite homes beneath Egyptian palaces, a pattern of forced assimilation, not annihilation. Pig bones are missing from the refuse, hinting at dietary boundaries kept even in bondage. Survival became more than a hope. It became a ritual. Each year, families gathered for a meal of lamb and unleavened bread, telling the story of escape and endurance. Passover was born, not just as a memory of liberation, but as a shield against forgetting. The anonymous pharaoh, remembered only for his cruelty, became the first in a long line of rulers who tried to control the future by controlling the children. But the Jews answered with memory, ritual, and the quiet defiance of survival. The pattern was set. Oppression met not just with resistance, but with the forging of identity, carried forward from generation to generation. In the shadow of Egypt's collapse, a new threat gathered strength to the north. The Assyrian Empire, ruled by kings like Tiglath-Pileser III and Sargon II, built its power not only on conquest, but on a cold, methodical system of control. In 722 BCE, Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel, fell after a brutal siege. Sargon II boasted in his own records that he deported 27,290 inhabitants from the city, scattering them across the far reaches of his empire. The prism of Sargon II, inscribed in cuneiform, lists these numbers as a mark of imperial achievement, not tragedy. This was more than a single act of violence. The Assyrians perfected a bureaucratic machinery for uprooting entire populations. Administrative tablets and reliefs from places like Lachish show chained captives, lines of deportees, and scribes recording names and possessions. Deportation was not random. Elites and skilled workers were targeted first: leaders, artisans, anyone who might rally resistance. Families were separated and sent to distant provinces like Hala, Gozan, and the cities of the Medes. In their place, the Assyrians imported settlers from Babylon, Cutha, and other conquered lands, creating a patchwork of unfamiliar languages and customs in the old Israelite heartland. The goal was simple: erase the memory of revolt by erasing the bonds that made a people. Assyrian policy did not single out the Jews alone. It was applied across the empire, from Damascus to Elam. But for the northern Israelites, this meant the loss of home, temple, and tribe. The 10 lost tribes faded into legend, their descendants absorbed into new cultures or lost to history. Yet the machinery of exile could not fully destroy identity. Archaeological layers in Samaria and the surrounding hills reveal pockets of continuity, local shrines, pottery styles, even dietary habits that hint at old traditions surviving beneath the surface. While the north was scattered, the memory of what was lost remained, carried by those who stayed behind and by stories passed down in the south. In the aftermath, the Jewish story did not vanish. It adapted, holding on to fragments of faith and practice as a shield against oblivion. In 586 BCE, Jerusalem fell to the armies of Nebuchadnezzar II. The Babylonian Chronicle records the end of the siege, and in the layers of ash unearthed on Mount Zion, the destruction is still visible today. The temple, once the heart of Jewish ritual and national life, was burned to the ground. Houses collapsed, palaces were stripped, and the city's leaders, priests, scribes, and nobles were taken in chains across the desert. The book of 2 Kings describes Nebuzaradan, the Babylonian general, razing the temple and palace, leaving only smoldering ruins behind. Yet exile did not mean the end. In Babylon, the fate of the Judean elite can be traced through cuneiform ration tablets. These clay records, dated between 592 and 570 BCE, list the daily allotments of oil and grain given to Jehoiachin, the exiled king of Judah, and his family. One entry reads 10 sila of oil to Jehoiachin, king of Judah, evidence that the royal line survived, if only as honored captives. Other Judeans received land grants and settled among the empire's diverse peoples, their names preserved in administrative lists. Dispossessed of their homeland and temple, the exiles turned inward. Prophetic writings flourished, Jeremiah's laments, Ezekiel's visions. Communal gatherings replaced the rituals of sacrifice. The synagogue, in its earliest form, became a place for study, prayer, and the reading of Torah. The memory of Jerusalem was kept alive not just in mourning, but in the hope of return. Even as the city lay in ruins, a new foundation was being laid, one built on text, memory, and the shared discipline of study. The destruction of the temple, intended to erase a people, instead gave birth to a culture rooted in resilience and learning, carried by those who refused to forget. A proclamation went out from the heart of the Persian Empire in 538 BCE. Cyrus the Great, newly crowned over Babylon's fallen territories, issued a decree unlike any the Jews had heard in generations. The edict, preserved in the words of Ezra and echoed on the clay of the Cyrus cylinder, granted the exiled Judeans permission to return home, not just to settle the land, but to rebuild the ruined temple in Jerusalem, a restoration of worship, law, and community life. The journey back was organized and deliberate. Ezra, chapter 1 records, lists of gold and silver vessels, temple treasures returned by imperial order, family heads, priests, and Levites gathered in caravans, supported by royal grants and guided by Persian officials. The numbers were modest, around 42,000 people, with servants and singers among them, but the purpose was clear. This was not a mass migration, but a sanctioned replanting of a people's roots. Cyrus's strategy was pragmatic. By restoring shrines and cults across his vast realm, he hoped to win loyalty from diverse subjects. For the Jews, this meant more than political favor. It meant the chance to rebuild their core institutions. Foundations for the Second Temple were laid on the old sacred site. Ezra and Nehemiah, later leaders, would oversee not just the stones and altars, but the renewal of law and the public reading of the Torah. New rituals took shape, blending memory of exile with hope for the future. The Persian policy did not erase the scars of Babylon, but it gave structure to survival. The temple would stand again, a symbol of return and a target for future rulers. For now, the decree of Cyrus offered a rare moment of imperial benevolence, a window in which a shattered community could gather, rebuild, and remember who they were. In 167 BCE, a royal decree swept through Judea with a force not seen since Babylon. Antiochus IV Epiphanes, ruler of the Seleucid Empire, ordered an end to Jewish law and ritual. Circumcision, the ancient sign of covenant, was outlawed on pain of death. Sabbath rest, once a weekly anchor, became a criminal act. The reading and possession of Torah scrolls, core to Jewish learning, were banned, with sacred texts seized and burned in public. Families were forced to eat pork and to sacrifice to foreign gods, violating the very boundaries that had defined Jewish life for centuries. The temple in Jerusalem, once the center of worship, was stripped of its holiness. Antiochus's men built an altar to Zeus Olympios on the sacred altar. Swine, the symbol of impurity, were slaughtered inside the sanctuary. The daily burnt offering, the Tamid, was halted. The Book of Daniel and 1 Maccabees call this act the abomination of desolation, a phrase that would echo in Jewish memory for generations. These measures were not random. Antiochus had just returned from failed campaigns in Egypt, his authority shaken. To unify his fractured realm, he turned to forced Hellenization, demanding that Jews abandon their ancestral ways for Greek customs. Some local leaders, eager for favor, urged him on. Others, branded rebels, faced execution. The king's decree criminalized identity itself, turning prayer, study, and rest into acts of defiance. Under threat of death, Jews faced a choice: compliance, martyrdom, or secret resistance. The lines were drawn, and the cost of faith became unbearably high. Judas Maccabeus stepped into history with a name that meant the hammer. He rallied his brothers and a band of villagers from Modian, choosing the hills over surrender. Outnumbered, they struck with speed and surprise, ambushing Seleucid patrols. and seizing enemy weapons. The book 1 Maccabees describes how Judas led his fighters against the armies of Apollonius and Saron, and then shattered the larger force of Gorgias at Emmaus. Victories piled up at Beth Horon and Beth Zur, each one freeing more ground for forbidden rituals to return. By 164 BCE, the road to Jerusalem lay open. 3 years after Antiochus's decrees, Judas and his men reclaimed the desecrated temple. They tore down the polluted altar, built a new one with uncut stones, and lit the menorah once more. The oil was scarce, but the flame burned for 8 days, the length of the rededication festival. Hanukkah was born, not from myth, but from the memory of a people who refused to let their light be snuffed out. Hasmonean coins soon appeared, stamped with ancient Hebrew script and palm branches. These were not just tokens of trade, but emblems of hard-won autonomy. For a brief generation, Judea minted its own currency and set its own laws. The story of the Maccabees became a model of resistance, proof that ritual, defended by force when needed, could outlast the might of kings. Jerusalem burned under a sky thick with smoke. In the summer of 70 CE, Roman legions under Titus pressed their siege to its breaking point. Josephus, who watched from the Roman camp, wrote of flames devouring the temple's cedar beams, gold melting and running between the stones. The sound of collapse echoed through the city, drowning out the cries of defenders and priests. For generations, the temple had stood as the heart of Jewish life, a place of sacrifice, prayer, and pilgrimage. Now its marble pillars crashed to the ground, its treasures seized as war prizes. Roman discipline met Jewish desperation at every barricade. Titus, son of the Emperor Vespasian, led his troops with methodical resolve. He had offered surrender, but the defenders refused. Starvation and disease had already claimed thousands inside the walls. When the Romans finally breached the city, the violence was total. Josephus describes priests hurling sacred vessels into the flames, refusing to let them fall into enemy hands. Others, trapped on the altar, died where they stood. The temple's sanctuary, once shielded by ritual and law, became a battlefield. The destruction did not end with fire. Roman soldiers stripped the city of anything valuable, herding survivors for sale in slave markets. Titus ordered the temple razed, leaving only a portion of the western retaining wall. The victors marched through the streets with spoils. The menorah, golden trumpets, and sacred table carried high above the heads of the legionaries. In Rome, these treasures became symbols of triumph. The Arch of Titus, carved in marble, still shows the procession, soldiers bearing the menorah, captives in chains, the emperor crowned by victory herself. With the temple gone, an era closed. The rituals that had defined a people were cut off in a single day. Yet the memory of what was lost would not fade. Survivors carried stories, prayers, and fragments of law into exile. In the ashes of Jerusalem, a new kind of endurance began, one that would outlast even Rome's glory. Hadrian's Rome viewed Judea as a problem to be solved, not a people to be understood. In 132 CE, a new decree swept through the province. The ancient rite of circumcision was outlawed, and Jerusalem was to be rebuilt as a pagan city named Aelia Capitolina. For many Jews, this was the final insult. Simon Bar Kosiba, called Bar Kokhba by his followers, rose as leader. His letters, unearthed centuries later in the caves near the Dead Sea, speak in a steady hand, orders to commanders, calls for discipline, reminders to keep the Sabbath even at war. The writing reveals a man, both militant and deeply rooted in tradition, convinced that Jewish sovereignty could be restored by force and faith alike. The revolt spread quickly. Villages and strongholds across Judea fell into rebel hands. Roman garrisons were overrun. For nearly 3 years, Bar Kokhba's government minted coins stamped with year 1 of the redemption of Israel. Yet Rome's response was relentless. Hadrian summoned legions from across the empire. The historian Cassius Dio records that 50 fortresses and nearly 1,000 villages were destroyed in the fighting. The final stand came at Betar. When the city fell, the losses were staggering. Tens of thousands killed, survivors sold into slavery or scattered across the empire. Hadrian's victory was absolute and vindictive. Judea was erased from the map, renamed Syria Palestina in imperial records. Jews were barred from Jerusalem on pain of death. Yet even as political autonomy vanished, a different kind of survival took root. In the coastal town of Yavne, rabbis gathered to rebuild not a nation, but a culture. They debated law, wrote down traditions, and shaped a Judaism that could live without a temple or a homeland. Synagogues multiplied from Galilee to Babylon, their walls echoing with study and prayer. The Bar Kokhba letters, once commands in a lost war, became artifacts of memory, The defeat that was meant to end Jewish life instead pushed it inward, toward text, community, and a resilience that outlasted every emperor. Around the world today, anti-Semitic incidents hit record highs, with over 3,600 cases reported in the United States alone last year, according to the Anti-Defamation League. The tactics change, but the threat persists. History is not just a warning, it is a reminder that targeted hatred never disappears on its own. Vigilance, memory, and community remain as urgent now as ever. What we defend today shapes who survives tomorrow.